everyone, this is Dee Marley with the History Bards podcast. Today we have the great privilege of welcoming to the show Katie Sweeting. And Katie Sweeting is the author of Remnant, which we're going to discuss today. And Katie, we would love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about you and your writing journey to get started.
Okay, great. I'll just give you a brief background.
Okay.
I was raised in California. I'm actually a Valley girl, if anybody knows what that
yes.
is.
Yes, 80s. Yes, we all know what Valley girls are. For sure.
Yes, exactly. I own it, but I met a man and he was a New Yorker. We actually met in Kenya, East Africa. So I ended up moving to New York in 1980 and have been on the East Coast ever since.
Okay.
I did not start out, I've always loved to read and write, and both of my parents were college professors. Mm-hmm. My dad taught psychology at Cal State Northridge, and my mom taught English at Santa Monica College. So I worked in nonprofits in New York City for about 20 years, and then said, I think I want to be a professor. So I got my master's degree in English at Queens College. And while I was working on my thesis, I read Equiano's interesting narrative. So Olaudah Equiano wrote the first slave narrative in 1789. And when I read that and studied it for my thesis, I learned that he got married to a white woman after he bought his freedom. They had 2 daughters, and everyone died except his youngest daughter. And I said, whatever happened to her? So that's why I wrote Remnant, to answer the question of what happened to Equiano's surviving daughter. It was about a 15-year journey of writing, research, traveling to England, South Carolina, other places, writing, getting an agent, sending it out again, and finally getting a publisher. So it's been a long journey, and I'm very happy that it's going to be published next week.
That's amazing. That sounds like a really fascinating book. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about the premise behind it? And
Okay.
For anybody who hasn't read the other one before, maybe a little bit about that one as well.
Okay. So Equiano wrote his narrative in 1789, and he starts in 1753 when he and his sister are kidnapped from their village in Nigeria. They are separated before they reach the coast. Half of my book is about his sister, and historically, scholars have discovered nothing about her. So that storyline is completely fictional. So he writes in his narrative that he was kidnapped, enslaved. He had a very different experience for a slave. He worked for a captain in the British Navy and worked on naval ships during the 7 Years' War. So he learned how to clean and fight and run ships. And then he was sold again and ended up in the West Indies. He did some little jobs on the side and was able to earn enough money to buy his freedom.
Wow.
In 1766. Then he settled in England and traveled. He was probably the most well-traveled African, almost to the North Pole, the Mediterranean, Turkey, back to the US, and self-published his book. So he would get subscribers to pay in advance for his book. And he went on a book tour, and he met his wife on a book tour, probably. And they got married and had 2 daughters. They got married. He wrote his narrative in 1789. They got married in 1792. They had a daughter in 1793. And the second daughter, Joanna, half the book is about Joanna. And then his wife died. He died. His first daughter died, leaving Joanna, this little biracial orphan in England, in 1797. So my book is covering what happened to his sister, who I name Olu, and what happened to his daughter, Joanna. And we know a little bit more about her. So I have kept the historicity of her life as much as possible, but then added my own imagination, filled in the blanks.
Oh man, that sounds really, really fascinating. So, can you tell us a little bit about? I know you said that it was because of you reading that book, but tell us a little bit about the research and the history of what you had to do. And I know you said that you traveled some about all of this, so we
Yeah.
would love to know more about that.
So to me, when I'm an English professor, and when I tell my students to do research, what do? They pull up their
Yeah.
keyboard and they look online.
Yes,
There is so much more to research than that. And I
yes, there
try and
is.
impress it upon them. And for myself, as a writer, and a lot of you watching this are writers, I think being in the place where your book takes place is invaluable.
It
Now,
really
if
is.
you're writing something in the future, that's not possible. But anything else, you can visit. So there's a few short scenes in my book in New York City during the Revolutionary War. I can take the PATH train over to New
Yeah.
York and be there in 15 minutes and take the walking tours of Lower Manhattan and
Mhm.
imagine what Manhattan was like in 1766.
Yeah.
I wanted to visit the places. I visited places in England that are not on the top 10 of anybody's list when they go to England. And that is a little town called Clavering, which is where
Oh,
Joanna and her husband lived. It's a beautiful little village northeast of London.
mhm.
And I visited Hull, which is up almost to the Scottish border, which again, nobody really visits. That's where William Wilberforce, who was a pivotal person in the abolition movement, that's where he lived, and there's a museum to him. I visited Joanna's grave in Abney Park
Oh,
Cemetery in London, and the places where Equiano wrote, and Cambridge, because there's a church outside Cambridge where there's a plaque on the wall to Joanna's sister. So just seeing Joanna's grave and this plaque just impressed upon me. I'm not making this up. These are real women, girls who lived and died. And then I went to South Carolina because for Olu's storyline, she ends up on a rice plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. So I visited 3 plantations. And after I wrote the scenes for them, I sent them to the historians at the plantations, had them checked for accuracy. So to me, the research is, yeah, you start online, you meet people who are experts and scholars in your topic and get everything you can out of them, and then you visit places. All of those are part of the research.
well, let me ask you this. So, how do you feel like that has changed you in your writing?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess you're used to giving good questions. You know, it's the combination of the fact and the imagination that is challenging when you're writing historical fiction. So you want to, I don't want to change anything historical. The things that we know, I want to make sure I preserve that. And in fact, in the back of the book, I have a section which I wish every historical novel did, which is fact or fiction.
That's
So
really
I
good.
cover chapter by chapter what really happened. And there's a lot that's historical in there, right? And sometimes when you're reading a historical novel, you're not sure what's true and what's not true. But for me, just the writing process and learning about these women gave me a lot more respect for what women went through in those time periods. So I'm covering from 1753 all the way through the 1820s in the 2 storylines. And then the storylines at one point meet, but you have to read the book to find
Oh
out.
yeah, definitely. Everybody definitely should read this book. So, along those same kind of lines, since you learned about so much about the history, about what women went through, how do you feel like that reading a book like this would impact women today?
I think we don't, women are not mentioned in history as much as men are, and men wrote the history. So we're not getting the female perspective, but just a simple fact that many women died in childbirth in the 17 and 1800s. If you got pregnant, you were taking a risk that you were going to die. We don't really think about that today, right?
Right. No.
And many women were responsible for caring for their families, even providing for their families. And in Olu's storyline, a lesser known fact about the Revolutionary War is a lot of slaves went to fight on the side of the British, and I would say even a majority of them contracted smallpox and died. So there's a lot in our US history that we are not taught. And in doing research for the book, I learned a lot about those episodes in our history that I never learned growing up.
Yeah, and I think that's really vital. Like you said, so much stuff is not taught that needs to be taught. How do you feel like historical fiction is like a venue for that?
I love historical fiction. I'm reading right now New York by Edward Rutherford,
Oh,
which
yeah.
starts in like the 1660s. Right now I'm in, we just got through the Depression.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm in 1953, but there's so much history in that book. Really, that book is almost like history and architecture with a little fiction in it.
And that's kind of how his books are. I love Edward Rutherford. He's a remarkable. He's kind of intimidating because you see how big his books are, and you're kind of like, well, but yes, definitely. If anybody's ever not read Edward Rutherford, that's a really good recommendation.
And two other books that I've read recently. So I love history, but I don't like history books. So I mainly read historical fiction. Abe Verghese is one of my absolute favorites. And I've spent time in India. I've lived in India. And he wrote Cutting for Stone several years ago. And his recent book, The Covenant of Water, is fabulous. And when you read it, you are transported to Kerala in South India. And you can feel the humidity, and you can feel the mosquitoes biting you, and you can smell the trees. I mean, he transports you. Another book that did that for me was A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth. And that one also takes place in India, mid 1900s, after partition. And there's 3 Hindu families and a Muslim family, and the mom is trying to find a suitable boy for her child. But for me, historical fiction, and also most recently I read The Women by Kristen Hanna. And all these memories of my childhood and the Vietnam War in the background came back to me when I was reading that book. So historical fiction transports me to another time and place that I might like better than the current time and place.
It definitely does. It's very transportive. And so is this something that you had always wanted to do?
I have always had a desire to write, and I guess you could say it runs in my family. My great grandfather was an Irish poet, and in the hills of Sausalito, there's a bench, and his name was Daniel O'Connell. My maiden name is O'Connell. There's a bench in the mountain that overlooks the bay there, and it has his name on it and his poem engraved in there. So it's kind of like the family bench, but and my grandmother, also on my dad's side, did a lot of writing. My sister writes. So I think it's that Irish side that wants to tell a story.
That's it. That's definitely it. We're a lot of us are like that. I have Irish and Scottish roots too, so you feel like that kind of comes through.
Yes.
So let me ask you this. You said that your book is coming out next week. Do you have like anything planned as far as book tours or events that we should know about?
Sure. So I have a book event this Sunday at a local Christian bookstore here in Jersey City. Then I'm doing the actual launch here at my college, Hudson County Community College, next Wednesday, the 24th at 2. Then I have an event on May 3rd at Jesus Book and Gift in Iceland, New Jersey. Another event on May 7th at my college at the North Hudson campus. And then June 15th at the Jersey City Public Library. I am still scheduling other events. I'm hoping to go to England, some of the places I visited, and also South Carolina.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Well, when you come to South Carolina, I am not that far, so just
Okay,
please let me know.
I
Um,
will.
myself, I had done a lot of research too, in South Carolina in the Gullah community, and
Oh,
so I
some
know.
of the language in here, I one of my beta readers is from Sierra Leone, and that
Okay,
Gullah language is
yes,
very, very similar to what they speak in Sierra Leone.
oh
And
yes,
one of the phrases I used in here, wet and dat. She's like, that's Gullah. I mean, I didn't realize it when I was writing it. I'm like, oh, that's fascinating.
yeah, that's really neat. So definitely, whenever you come down this way, we'd love to know that you're close by, that maybe we can come to one of your signings. So to all our and please tell our listeners how they can find out about your books.
Okay, so I have a website. It's just katiesweeting.com. I'm I have an affiliate site on Bookshop. I'm still figuring that out, but you can buy books from my site on Bookshop, or you can
Okay.
just go to bookshop.org, amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, all the major sites, it will be there. So you can go to any of them. Also, I have a lot of friends in India. It will be on amazon.in a few days after launch. It's also available in the UK.
Okay, that sounds great. I was going to mention that when we were talking about earlier about books that we like. One of my favorite writers about India, because I love India as well. MMK, she got me started like writing, wanting to write in historical fiction. A passage, not a passage to India. Yeah, yeah, Passage to India. No, that was a getting confused here. Anyway, MMK, I love her books.
Okay, I will check it out. I
Yeah,
will
and
check
I'm
it
going to
out.
check out your books, the ones that you mentioned as well. And
Okay.
to all our listeners, we definitely want to check out your recommendations and check out yours, which brings me to the next question.
Yeah.
What are you working on now? Are you like
Okay.
what's in the future for you?
So again, to all my writers, we try and get reviews. We're told how important that is.
Yes.
So I used Book Sirens and I used Book Sprout, and I found them both very helpful.
Yes.
And one review that I looked at from Book Sprout, I believe, said, I can't wait to read what Katie Sweeting writes next. I
Yes.
have written another novel. Actually, I wrote it during NaNoWriMo, National Novel
Uh-huh.
Writing Month. And that is about deaf characters and a woman who becomes an obstetrician. That's kind of on the back burner. But
Okay.
I have already started the sequel to Remnant. So with the same
Oh, nice.
characters, and that one will be set in the War of 1812.
Okay.
So that'll be in a couple years.
Yeah, definitely, because we know how research goes for historical fiction. Well, that
Yes.
sounds really fascinating, and thank you so much for sharing that. Let me ask you this. So, how do you feel about? I know you were saying that you had some really good reviews, but how do you feel about reviews, bad ones and good ones? How do you feel like that teaches us as writers?
What I tell my students and anybody who's writing is you have to develop a thick skin. It's
Yes,
not personal. You
yes,
cannot be crushed by any rejection or bad review. So I think the plan for me going forward is not to read all the bad reviews. Hopefully I don't get too many. But interesting. One of the reviews that I did see already was mixed. So she gave me 4 stars out of 5. But the two things that she highlighted were things that I was already aware of, right?
okay,
And decided to kind of do anyway.
uh-huh,
So you probably won't be surprised by your reviews. And reading is very personal. You
it
can
is.
know a person and think they'll like a book and they just won't like it.
Yes,
And I can't even describe why some books I pick up and I just don't want to read them. So it's very personal, it's very subjective.
yes,
So we just can't be crushed or disheartened by
yes.
reviews. Actually, we should use that as ammunition to keep going.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I'll never forget going to a retreat one time and they told us, this is your baby, but you need to be prepared for someone saying that you have an ugly baby.
That is true.
And that's very sensitive, because you put so much time and effort and years of research, and your first thought is everybody's going to want to read this and everybody's going to love it like you do.
Right.
Which kind of brings me to our last point is we put so much passion into our writing. How do you feel about the equal passion that you need to have in marketing?
You can see by my expression. My sister had her own book publicity company for years, and she has helped me a lot.
Great.
I don't love the marketing. I'm on social media. I've actually done a 30-day launch. I've done a short video every day and I'm on day 8. And that has been fun, I will say. And I'm engaging with my Indian friends more on Instagram and my colleagues on LinkedIn. And I'm going to put them all up on YouTube. But I'll tell you what's been the most fun about the marketing. And it's not really marketing my own book. So I have endorsers. We all try and get endorsers. I am promoting my endorsers, and I'm getting to know a lot of people who are getting books out right now. I have a cousin who just published a poetry book. I bought the book, I reviewed the book, I went to her Zoom talk. So I'm reading and reviewing and promoting other authors' books, and that's been fun, more so than promoting my own book.
Yes. No, I understand. Marketing is such a challenge for authors, and I think it has to do with it doesn't fit into our creative side. It's more about the business side, and that's a really hard thing to transition into. So it's completely understandable. I think we all have that challenge.
Yes.
Well, Katie, thank you so much for being on the show today. We really appreciate it, and we wish you much success on your novel.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And to all of our listeners, thank you for listening today. And as always, this is Dee Marley at the History Bards podcast. Keep making history and keep listening.